My name is Paige, and at 27 years old, I was finally holding the ticket that represented my freedom. I was minutes away from boarding the plane to New York when my phone buzzed with a message from my older sister. The text, screaming in capital letters, read, "Mom and Dad had an accident. They need to see you urgently. Come back now." My heart stopped beating for a second because the thought of losing my parents terrified me more than anything. I immediately ran back to the check-in counter to cancel my flight without caring that I was throwing away the most important job interview of my career. I sprinted out of the terminal with tears blurring my vision, but just as I reached my car, another message appeared from an unknown number. I froze when I read the chilling words, "Don't go back. They're acting." I wanted to believe it was a prank, but the fear that my parents were critically injured was too overpowering to ignore. I started the engine and drove home as fast as I could, while praying that I was not too late to say goodbye. I arrived at the house with my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn off the ignition. I rushed toward the front door, but something made me stop and look through the living room window first. I expected to see a scene of sorrow or emptiness, but what I witnessed through that glass made me freeze in absolute horror. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more shocking family dramas. 2 weeks before I stood paralyzed outside that living room window, my life was nothing but a suffocating loop beneath the relentless heat of New Mexico. I had spent 5 long years working as an undervalued junior architect at a local firm while dreaming of escaping the dusty horizon that seemed to trap me in Albuquerque forever. The email that changed everything arrived on a mundane Tuesday morning, and it contained a job offer from a prestigious architecture firm in New York City, with a salary triple what I was currently earning. This offer letter was not just a career advancement, but the only golden ticket I would ever get to liberate myself from the invisible chains of my family. I rushed home that evening with a heart full of hope to share the incredible news with the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally, but the reaction I received was like a bucket of ice water. My father, Clifford, and my mother, Diane, sat at the dinner table with stone-cold expressions, while Sierra barely looked up from her phone to acknowledge my presence. I placed the printed offer letter on the table with trembling hands and waited for a smile or a word of congratulations that never came. The silence stretched on for an agonizing minute until Sierra finally broke it, with a scoff that dripped with pure venom and jealousy. She looked me dead in the eye and asked if I really thought I was talented enough to survive in a brutal city like New York, or if I would come crawling back begging for cash within a month. I tried to defend myself by explaining that the firm had scouted me specifically for my portfolio, but my mother immediately started crying about how her chronic migraines were getting worse. She wailed about how difficult it would be to manage the household chores and the grocery shopping without my constant help and financial contribution. My father slammed his hand on the table and reminded me that the family was drowning in old debts, which made my desire to leave seem incredibly selfish and ungrateful in his eyes. They spent the next few days wearing me down with relentless guilt trips about their failing health and unpaid bills until I felt like a criminal for wanting a better life. I found myself wavering under the immense pressure they exerted, because their manipulation was designed to make me feel responsible for their happiness. It was my best friend who finally snapped me out of that toxic trance during a coffee run, where I broke down in tears of frustration. She grabbed my shoulders firmly to make me look at her and told me that I was not the family babysitter or their walking bank account, so I needed to leave and never look back. Her words sparked a fire in my chest that burned away the guilt, and I realized that if I stayed, I would eventually wither away just like my dreams. I made the decision to accept the job offer that very afternoon, and I knew I needed to secure my finances before I announced my final departure. I went to the bank the next morning and withdrew $50,000 from the joint savings account that I had contributed to for years. This account was technically under both my name and my parents' names, because it was opened when I was a minor, but every single cent inside belonged to my hard work. I knew that leaving the money there meant they would drain it the moment I left the state, so I transferred it to a private cashier's check to take with me. The notification of that large withdrawal must have alerted my father immediately, because the atmosphere in the house shifted from passive-aggressive to dangerously silent. I packed my bags in secret that night, while listening to them whispering furiously in the kitchen downstairs about what they should do next. I assumed they were just angry about losing control over my finances, but I never imagined they would stoop so low as to fake a tragedy. The grim reality was that my attempt to claim my independence had ignited a rage within them that would lead to the terrifying text message I received at the airport. I drove away the next morning thinking I had won my freedom, but I had no idea that they had already set a trap to drag me back into their cage. 30 minutes after leaving the airport, I pushed open the familiar oak door of my childhood home while carrying a mix of extreme anxiety and suspicion. I had prepared myself to see paramedics rushing through the hallway, or to hear the agonizing sounds of my mother in pain from a terrible crash. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins so hard that my hands were shaking as I stepped into the living room to face the tragedy. The scene that greeted me was so completely detached from the horrific text message that my brain struggled to process the reality of what I was seeing. There was no blood, and there were no bandages, because my parents and Sierra were sitting comfortably on the beige sofa with open beer bottles and a half-eaten pepperoni pizza on the coffee table. The sound of the television was blaring a game show, and they looked up at me with expressions that ranged from mild amusement to complete indifference. The realization that I had sacrificed my future for a lie hit me with the force of a physical blow, and my concern instantly evaporated into a blinding rage. I dropped my car keys on the floor with a loud clatter that finally made them turn the volume down on the TV. I screamed at them with a voice that cracked from the sheer intensity of my betrayal, because I could not understand their cruelty. How could you joke about life and death like that when I just canceled the most important flight of my life? Sierra leaned back against the cushions with a satisfied smirk playing on her lips as she took a slow sip of her beer. She did not look the least bit apologetic for the panic she had caused, or the career opportunity she had just destroyed with a few keystrokes. She placed her drink down on a coaster and looked at me with eyes that were cold and calculating. We did what was necessary because someone had to stop you from making a huge mistake and stealing money that doesn't belong to you. Her admission was so casual that it made my stomach turn, but I refused to let them see me cry in that moment. I stared at each of them with pure hatred before grabbing the handle of my suitcase to turn around and walk right back out the door. I was determined to drive to a hotel or sleep in my car if I had to, because I knew I could never spend another night under the same roof as these monsters. I had my hand on the doorknob when the booming voice of my father stopped me cold in my tracks. "If you take one step out of this house, I will make sure you leave in the back of a police cruiser." Tool. I turned around slowly to see Clifford standing up from his armchair with a thick manila folder held tightly in his hand. He tossed the file onto the coffee table where it slid across the surface and stopped right in front of me. I walked over to inspect the documents and felt the blood drain from my face as I read the headers on the paperwork. It was a formal police report filed earlier that morning which accused me of elder financial abuse and grand theft for emptying the joint savings account. He walked toward me with a menacing calmness that was far more terrifying than his usual shouting matches. He explained that since his name was technically on the account alongside mine, he had every legal right to claim that I had stolen his retirement funds. He knew exactly how the system worked, and he was weaponizing the law to turn my own hard-earned savings into a criminal indictment. "Walk out that door, and the police will be here in 5 minutes to arrest you for stealing $50,000 from a senior citizen." I tried to argue that the money was from my paychecks and that I had the deposit slips to prove it, but he cut me off with a cruel laugh. He reminded me that an investigation would take months to clear my name, and by that time my record would be flagged. No architecture firm in New York or anywhere else would hire a candidate with a pending felony charge for financial crimes against their own parents. The trap was perfect and inescapable because he was willing to destroy my reputation permanently just to keep me under his control. I looked at Diane for any sign of maternal instinct, but she simply avoided my gaze and took a nervous bite of her pizza. I realized then that I was completely alone in this battle, and that fighting them right now would result in me losing everything I had worked for. My grip on the suitcase loosened and I let it fall to the floor as a symbol of my defeat. I had to swallow the scream building in my throat and accept their blackmail, because my freedom was now being held hostage by the people who gave me life. That night, the sweltering heat of the desert couldn't compare to the suffocation and despair enveloping my room like a heavy shroud. I was lying in the oppressive darkness of my childhood bedroom, which had transformed from a sanctuary into a prison cell within the span of a few hours. My father had confiscated my car keys and my driver's license immediately after threatening me with the police report to ensure I had no physical means of escape. They had effectively stripped me of my identity and autonomy, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and an overwhelming sense of violation. I listened to the muffled sounds of the television downstairs where my family was continuing their celebration, as if they hadn't just taken a hostage in their own home. I felt a level of hopelessness that was physically painful because I realized my parents were willing to cannibalize my future to sustain their own comfort. I buried my face in my pillow to stifle a sob when suddenly I felt a vibration against my cheek from the secret burner phone I had hidden under the pillowcase. I had kept this old device for emergencies ever since I started planning my escape months ago, and it seemed that the emergency had finally arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled the glowing screen into the safety of the sheets and saw the same unknown number from the airport calling me. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, wondering if this was another trick before my desperation forced me to slide the answer button. A deep and raspy male voice spoke on the other end before I could even whisper a hello, asking if I was safe to talk. He introduced himself as Mr. Reed, and the name instantly triggered a vague memory of violent arguments between my parents nearly 5 years ago. I remembered my father cursing that name during dinner conversations and blaming Mr. Reed for business failures that had supposedly cost our family a fortune. I asked him with a trembling whisper why he was contacting me now and how he knew what was happening inside my house. Mr. Reed explained that he had been keeping tabs on Clifford for years because he knew my father was a man who eventually destroyed everyone around him. He told me that he knew I was being held against my will, but he needed me to understand that the situation was far more dangerous than just a dispute over $50,000. I listened in stunned silence as he revealed the true motivation behind the desperate measures my family had taken to keep me in Albuquerque. Mr. Reed lowered his voice as if he was afraid someone might be listening in on the line and delivered the news that shattered my understanding of my sister completely. Your sister isn't just jealous of your success, Paige. She owes a huge debt to the mob due to a severe online gambling addiction. The revelation made the room spin because it explained the erratic behavior and the constant lack of money that Sierra had exhibited over the last year. Mr. Reed continued to explain that Sierra had gambled away every cent she had and had borrowed money from dangerous loan sharks who were now threatening to come for her life. The $50,000 I had in my account was merely a drop in the bucket compared to what she owed to these criminals. The terrifying reality was that my parents didn't just want me to stay home to do chores or pay utility bills like they claimed. They are going to force you to sign a loan application tomorrow morning using your clean credit history, Mr. Reed said, with an urgency that chilled my blood. Sierra has ruined her own credit score, and your parents are bankrupt, so you are the only fresh host they can attach to. The plan was a masterclass in manipulation because they intended to use my identity to secure a massive high-interest loan to pay off the mobsters while leaving me drowning in debt for decades. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized that my own mother and father were serving me up as a financial sacrifice to save their favorite daughter from the consequences of her vices. The betrayal was absolute, but amidst the horror of his words, I felt a tiny spark of resistance ignite in my chest. I was not alone in this nightmare anymore, because this stranger from the past seemed to know exactly where the bodies were buried. Mr. Reed told me to stay calm and play along for now, because he had a plan to help me turn the tables on them if I was brave enough to trust him. The voice of Mr. Reed on the phone was low and raspy, carrying a resentment that had been suppressed for 5 long years. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear as he began to unravel the tangled history that connected his ruin to my father's current tyranny. He explained that half a decade ago he and Clifford were not just casual acquaintances, but equal partners in a promising construction firm that was beginning to make a name for itself in Albuquerque. Mr. Reed was the brilliant mind behind the designs and the structural engineering, while my father was responsible for managing the finances and the client relationships. The partnership worked perfectly on paper until the company started winning major bids that brought in serious money and recognition. Mr. Reed told me that the trouble began when clients started asking exclusively for him because they trusted his expertise and vision far more than my father's smooth-talking sales pitches. Clifford became consumed by a toxic jealousy that rotted him from the inside out because he could not stand the thought of sharing the spotlight or the profits with anyone else. The betrayal was not a sudden impulse but a meticulously calculated strike that my father planned over several months while smiling in his partner's face. Clifford used his access to the company accounts to slowly falsify a series of invoices and wire transfers that made it look like Mr. Reed was siphoning funds for personal use. Your father called the police the moment the money transferred to my personal account without me even knowing it was there, Mr. Reed said with a bitterness that made my skin crawl. I lost my architecture license. My house and my marriage fell apart under the stress while he took the entire company for himself. I listened in horrified silence as he described how Clifford had played the role of the victimized partner perfectly in front of the authorities. My father had presented the forged documents with such conviction that Mr. Reed never stood a chance in court and was forced to accept a plea deal to avoid prison time. The injustice of it was suffocating because I could see the exact same pattern of manipulation happening to me right now with the accusation of stealing the $50,000. Mr. Reed explained that for the last 5 years he had been living in the shadows working under the table as a handyman because no legitimate firm would hire an architect with a record of embezzlement. He had spent every spare moment of his exile watching my family and waiting for Clifford to make a mistake that would expose his true nature. He knew about Sierra's gambling addiction because he had followed her to the shady back rooms where she threw away thousands of dollars, and he had seen the loan sharks intimidating her in parking lots. He realized that Clifford was desperate for cash to cover Sierra's mess, which was why they had set this trap for me. Mr. Reed told me that he had enough circumstantial evidence to know what was happening, but he lacked the one thing that could clear his name and save mine, which was a direct confession from Clifford himself. I can help you get out of this page, but I need you to be my hands and eyes inside that house, Mr. Reed proposed with a serious tone. I need you to help me get a recording of him admitting to what he did to me and what he is doing to you. The plan he outlined was risky and required me to act against every instinct I had to fight back or scream at my parents. He told me that a narcissist like Clifford would never admit fault if challenged, but he would happily brag about his genius if he thought he had already won. We needed to execute a counterplot where I would feign complete surrender to stroke his ego until he felt comfortable enough to gloat. I agreed to the deal with a shaking voice because I realized that this broken man on the phone was the only person in the world who understood the monster I was living with. We spent the rest of the call going over the specific psychological triggers I needed to use to make my father unlock the vault of his secrets. The next morning, I woke up with a heart that was pounding against my ribs, but my brain was colder and sharper than it had ever been. I knew that the performance I was about to give would determine the rest of my life, so I spent a few minutes staring at my reflection in the mirror to perfect the look of a defeated woman. I secured the tiny microphone underneath the collar of my blouse and verified that the call was active before hiding the phone deep inside the pocket of my jeans. Mr. Reed was already listening on the other end of the line, and his silent presence gave me the courage to walk out of my bedroom to face the execution squad waiting downstairs. I deliberately messed up my hair and kept my shoulders slumped forward to make sure they believed that my spirit had been completely broken by their threats. I walked down the stairs with heavy steps and entered the living room where the atmosphere was thick with a sickening sense of triumph. My parents and Sierra were seated around the coffee table like vultures circling a carcass, and they were not alone this time. A man in a cheap gray suit whom I assumed was their lawyer was arranging a massive stack of documents that would legally bind me to a lifetime of financial slavery. Sierra looked up from her phone with a smirk that made my blood boil because she looked incredibly refreshed for someone who was supposedly in mortal danger from loan sharks. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the glass table and gestured impatiently for me to sit down so we could get this over with. My father watched me take my seat with a look of supreme satisfaction because he truly believed he had maneuvered me into a corner from which there was no escape. The lawyer pushed the thick pile of loan applications toward me without saying a word and handed me a heavy black pen. I looked down at the papers and saw that the loan amount was even higher than I had anticipated, which meant Sierra's gambling debt was astronomical. I picked up the pen with a hand that I forced to tremble visibly and let a single tear roll down my cheek to sell the act. I hesitated with the tip of the pen hovering over the signature line while my family leaned in closer with greedy anticipation in their eyes. I took a shaky breath and looked up at my father to deliver the line that Mr. Reed and I had carefully scripted the night before. I asked him with a voice that sounded small and broken why he was doing this to his own daughter, and if it was because I reminded him of Mr. Reed from 5 years ago. The mention of his old partner's name acted exactly like the spark we had hoped for, because it instantly pierced through his arrogance. Clifford's expression shifted from smugness to a flash of irritation, before settling into a look of twisted pride. He clearly felt that he was untouchable in his own home, and the urge to brag about his dominance was too strong for a narcissist like him to resist. He leaned back in his armchair and laughed with a sound that rumbled deep in his chest, as if my question was the most amusing thing he had heard all day. Clifford looked at me with a terrifying intensity and told me that I was smarter than I looked because I had finally figured out how the world actually worked. He explained with a chilling calmness that people like Mr. Reed were weak idealists who believed in fairness, while people like him were the ones who actually shaped reality. "You are smart, Paige, but you need to learn the most important lesson of all," he said while pointing a finger at me. "The weak must always accept being used by the strong because that is the natural order of things." He admitted right there in front of everyone that he had crushed Mr. Reed simply because he could, and that he was doing the same to me for the benefit of the family. He mocked Mr. Reed for not having the spine to do what was necessary to win, and claimed that his manipulation of the company funds was a stroke of genius rather than a crime. I kept my head down to hide the glint of victory in my eyes as he continued to ramble on about his brilliance. I knew that every single word of his arrogant confession was being captured by the device on my collar and recorded by the man he thought he had destroyed. Mr. Reed was on the other end of the line, listening to his nemesis dig his own grave with every sentence. The atmosphere in the living room seemed to stagnate after my father's arrogant answer regarding his betrayal of Mr. Reed. Clifford believed that I was completely under his control, so he felt comfortable enough to turn his past crimes into a twisted educational moment for his defeated daughter. He leaned forward with a gleam in his eyes to describe exactly how he had manipulated the bank transfers 5 years ago to make his partner look like a criminal. He bragged about the falsified signatures and the fake invoices with a level of detail that was sickening because he viewed the destruction of Mr. Reed's life as his greatest professional achievement. My father wanted me to understand that morality was a weakness and that his ability to frame an innocent man was proof of his superiority in this dog-eat-dog world. I sat there listening to him incriminate himself with every breath, while the tiny microphone beneath my collar captured the evidence that Mr. Reed had waited half a decade to hear. The lawyer sitting next to him seemed uncomfortable with the candid confession, but he remained silent because he was being paid well to ignore the moral rot of this family. I waited until Clifford finally finished his lecture on power dynamics, before slowly turning my head to look at my sister, who was impatiently checking her watch. I knew that I needed to get her admission on the recording as well to ensure that the police had a complete picture of the extortion taking place. "And what about you, Sierra?" I asked with a voice that I kept intentionally low and trembling. "How long do you intend to make me pay for your gambling addiction instead of taking responsibility?" The question acted like a lit match thrown into a pool of gasoline because Sierra had zero patience for being questioned by the sibling she considered beneath her. She slammed her hand on the table and glared at me with pure hatred for daring to stall the process that would save her skin. Her face turned red with anger as she lost her temper completely and screamed the words that would seal her fate in a court of law. "I already took your information to borrow the money, so stop asking stupid questions. You just need to sign the papers to legalize it, you idiot." Her admission hung in the air like a guillotine blade because she had just confessed to identity theft and fraud in front of witnesses. I felt a wave of cold satisfaction wash over me as I realized we had everything we needed to bury them under the weight of their own arrogance. I stopped the act immediately and let the trembling in my hands vanish as I placed the heavy black pen down on the table with a deliberate click. My parents looked confused by the sudden change in my demeanor because the broken daughter they thought they had crushed was replaced by someone who looked at them with ice in her veins. "Thank you for confessing everything," I said calmly while looking directly into my father's confused eyes. I reached into my pocket to pull out the phone that had been broadcasting our entire conversation and pressed the button to activate the speakerphone. The room went deadly silent as the distinct and familiar voice of Mr. Reed filled the space with a tone of ultimate victory. "I have recorded every single word you said, Clifford," Mr. Reed announced with a deep satisfaction. "The police are right outside your door." My father's face drained of all color as the realization of what just happened crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. Before anyone could react or reach for the phone, the front door burst open with a deafening crash as a SWAT team and uniformed officers flooded into the entryway. Chaos erupted instantly as the officers shouted commands for everyone to get on the ground, while Sierra began to shriek in high-pitched terror. I remained seated calmly in the middle of the storm while I watched the officers pull my parents and sister roughly from their comfortable seats. The sight of Clifford being forced to his knees was a stark contrast to the arrogant man who had been lecturing me on power only moments ago. He struggled against the officer who was tightening the handcuffs around his wrists and looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You dare frame me!" he screamed at the top of his lungs while spit flew from his mouth. "I am your father. I gave you life." I stood up slowly and looked down at the man who had tried to sell my future to cover his mistakes. I felt absolutely nothing for him in that moment except a profound sense of relief that the nightmare was finally over. I did not say a word to him because he no longer deserved my voice or my energy. I simply watched in silence as the police dragged my screaming family out the door and into the blinding sunlight where justice was waiting to greet them. 6 months have passed since the day the police cruiser took my family away from the house in Albuquerque, leaving behind the silence I had always longed for. The scorching heat of the New Mexico desert has finally faded into a memory as I sit in my new apartment, watching the snow fall gently over the bustling streets of Manhattan. The legal proceedings following that chaotic morning were surprisingly swift because the audio evidence Mr. Reed and I captured was undeniable in the eyes of the law. Clifford and Diane were sentenced to significant prison terms for their extortion attempt against me and for the historical fraud they committed against their former partner. Sierra received an even harsher sentence than our parents because the court found her guilty of multiple counts of identity theft and severe financial fraud related to her gambling debts. I did not attend their sentencing hearing because I had already said everything I needed to say on the day they were arrested in our living room. Mr. Reed was finally able to walk into the State Board of Architecture with his head held high to reclaim the license that had been stolen from him 5 years ago. The court ordered the liquidation of my father's remaining assets to pay restitution to Mr. Reed, which allowed him to restart the firm he had built with dignity. He called me last week to thank me again for my help, and his voice sounded lighter than I had ever heard it before. My journey to New York was not as immediate as I had originally planned because I had to stay behind for a few weeks to assist with the investigation. I eventually gathered the courage to contact the architecture firm in New York to explain exactly why I had missed my flight and my interview that fateful day. I sent them an updated portfolio along with a brutally honest letter detailing the family crisis I had overcome and my determination to move forward. To my absolute surprise, the hiring manager replied within 24 hours, stating that the partners were incredibly impressed by my resilience and honesty in the face of such a personal disaster. They told me that talent can be taught, but integrity and strength are inherent traits, so they were offering me a second chance to join their team. I packed my bags for the final time and left Albuquerque without looking in the rearview mirror because there was nothing left for me in that house but bad memories. I am now working on designing skyscrapers that scrape the clouds, and for the first time in my life, I am keeping every cent that I earn. The freedom I feel is not just about the financial independence, but about the peace of mind that comes from knowing I am safe from manipulation. I have made new friends here who appreciate me for who I am, rather than what I can provide for them, and that has made all the difference. The most profound lesson I learned from this agonizing experience is that toxic relationships often hide behind the sacred label of family to avoid accountability. We are taught from a young age that we must honor our parents and support our siblings no matter what the cost may be to our own well-being. However, there is a distinct line between being supportive and being sacrificed for someone else's selfish gain, and crossing that line is not an act of love, but an act of self-destruction. Breaking free from my family was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was necessary because you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine care rather than